Hello, and welcome to Topher Reads The Hobbit, Day 6. When we last left Bilbo, the dwarves, and Gandalf, they were captured by goblins and brought down into the depths of the mountain, where they were brought into a large cavern. So, let's see what happens. A lot of exciting things coming in the next few days, so let's get to it. The song sounded truly terrifying. The walls echoed to the clap, snap, and the crush, smash, and to the ugly laughter of their ho, ho, my lad. The general meaning of the song was only too plain, for now the goblins took out whips and whipped them with a swish, smack, and set them running as fast as they could in front of them, and more than one of the dwarves were already yammering and bleating like anything when they stumbled into a big cavern. It was lit by a great red fire in the middle, by the torches along the walls, and it was full of goblins. They all laughed and stamped and clapped their hands when the dwarves, with poor little Bilbo at the back and nearest to the whips, came running in, while the goblin drivers whooped and cracked their whips behind. The ponies were already there, huddled in a corner, and they were all the baggages and packages lying broken open and being rummaged by goblins and smelt by goblins and fingered by goblins and quarreled over by goblins. I am afraid that was the last they ever saw of those excellent little ponies, including a jolly sturdy little white fellow that Elrond had lent to Gandalf since his horse was not suitable for the mountain paths. Goblins eat horses and ponies and donkeys and other much more dreadful things, and they are always hungry. Just now, however, the prisoners were thinking of only themselves. The goblins chained their hands behind their backs and linked them all together in a line and dragged them into the far end of the cavern with little Bilbo tugging at the end of the row. There, in the shadows, on a large flat stone, sat a tremendous goblin with a huge head, and armed goblins were standing round him carrying the axes and the bent swords that they use. Now, goblins are cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted. They make no beautiful things, but they make many clever things. They can tunnel and mine as well as any but the most skilled dwarves. And when they want to take the trouble, though, they are usually untidy and dirty. Hammers, axes, swords, daggers, pickaxes, tongs, and also instruments of torture they can make very well, or get other people to make to their design, prisoners and slaves that have to work till they die for want of air and light. It is not unlikely that they invented some of the machines that have since troubled the world, especially the ingenious devices for killing large numbers of people at once, for wheels and engines and explosions have always delighted them, and also not working with their own hands more than they could help. But in those days, and in those wild parts, they had not advanced, as it is called, so far. They did not hate dwarves especially, no more than they hated everybody and everything, and particularly the orderly and prosperous. In some parts, wicked dwarves had even made alliances with the goblins, but they had a special grudge against Thorin's people because of the war which you have heard mentioned, but which does not come into this tale. And anyway, goblins don't care who they catch, as long as it is done smart and secret, and the prisoners are not able to defend themselves. "Who are these miserable persons?" said the great goblin.
"Dwarves, and this,"
said one of the drivers, pulling at Bilbo's chain so that he fell forward onto his knees.
"We found them sheltering in our front porch."
"And what do you mean by it?" said the great goblin, turning to Thorin. "Up no good, I warrant. Spying on the private business of my people, I guess. Thieves, I shouldn't be surprised to learn. Murderers and friends of elves, not unlikely. Come, what have you got to say?"
"Thorin, the dwarf, at your service,"
he replied. It was merely a polite nothing. Of the things which you suspect and imagine, we had no idea at all. We sheltered from a storm in what seemed a convenient cave and unused. Nothing was further from the thoughts than inconveniencing goblins in any way whatsoever. And that was true enough. So you say, might I ask what you were doing up in the mountains at all, and where you were coming from and where you were going to? In fact, I should like to know all about you. Not that it will do you much good, though in Oakenshield I know too much about your folk already. But let's have the truth, or I will prepare something particularly uncomfortable for you. We were on a journey to visit our relatives, our nephews and nieces and first, second, and third cousins, and the other descendants of our grandfathers who live in the east side of these truly hospitable mountains, said Thorin, not quite knowing what to say all at once in a moment, when obviously the exact truth would not do at all.
He is a liar, O truly tremendous one. Several of our people were struck by lightning in the cave when we invited these creatures to come below, and they are as dead as stones. Also, he has not explained this.
He held out the sword which Thorin had worn, the sword which came from the troll's lair. The great goblin gave a truly awful howl of rage when he looked upon it, and all his soldiers gnashed their teeth and clashed their shields, and they stamped. They knew the sword at once. It had killed hundreds of goblins in its time when the fair elves of Gondolin hunted them in the hills or did battle before their walls. The elves had called it Orcrist, goblin cleaver, but the goblins called it simply biter. They hated it, and hated worse anyone that carried it. Murderers and elf friends! Slash them, beat them, bite them, gnash them, take them away to dark holes full of snakes and never let them see the light again. He was in such a rage that he jumped off his seat and himself rushed at Thorin with his open mouth. Just at that moment all the lights in the cavern went out and a great fire went off into a tower of blue glowing smoke right up to the roof that scattered piercing white sparks all among the goblins. The yells and yammering, croaking, gibbering and jabbering, howls, growls and curses, shrieking and skriking that followed were beyond description. Several hundred wild cats and wolves being roasted slowly alive together would not have compared with the sound. The sparks were burning holes in the goblins, and the smoke that now fell from the roof made the air too thick for even their eyes to see through. Soon they were falling over one another and rolling in heaps on the floor, biting and kicking and fighting as if they had all gone mad. Suddenly a sword flashed in its own light. Bilbo saw it go right through the great goblin as he stood dumbfounded in the middle of his rage. And the great goblin fell dead, and the goblin soldiers fled before the sword, shrieking in the darkness. The sword went back into its sheath. "Follow me, quick!" said a voice fierce and quiet, and before Bilbo understood what had happened, he was trotting along again as fast as he could trot at the end of the line, down more dark passages with the yells of the goblin hall growing fainter behind him. A pale light was leading them on. "Quicker, quicker! The torches will soon be relit." "Half a minute," said Dori, who was at the back next to Bilbo, and he was a decent fellow. He made the hobbit scramble on his shoulders as best as he could with his tied hands, and then off they all went at a run with a clink-clink of chains and many a stumble, since they had no hands to steady themselves with. Not for a long while did they stop, and by that time they must have been right down in the very mountain's heart. Then Gandalf lit up his wand. Of course it was Gandalf, but just then they were too busy to ask how he got there. He took out his sword again, and again it flashed in the dark by itself. It burned with a rage that made it gleam if goblins were about, and now it was bright as blue flame for delight in the killing of the great lord of the cave. It made no trouble whatever of cutting through the goblin chains. and it set all the prisoners free as quickly as possible. The sword's name was Glamdring the Foe Hammer, if you remember. The goblins just called it Beater, and they hated it worse than Biter, if possible. Orcris, too, had been saved, for Gandalf had brought it along as well, snatching it from one of the terrified guards. Gandalf thought of most things, and though he could not do everything, he could do a great deal for friends who were in a tight corner. "Are we all here?" Handing his sword back to Thorn with a bow. "Let me see. 1, that's Thorn. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Where are Feely and Keely? Ah, here they are. 12, 13, and Mr. Baggins, 14. Well, well, it might be worse. And then again, it could be a good deal better. No ponies, no food, and no knowing quite where we are, and hordes of angry goblins just behind. On we go." And on they went. Gandalf was quite right. They began to hear goblin noises and horrible cries far behind in the passages they had come through. That sent them on faster than ever, and as poor Bilbo could not possibly go half as fast, for dwarves can roll along at a tremendous pace, I can tell you, when they have to, they took it in turn to carry him on their backs. Still, goblins go faster than dwarves, and these goblins knew the way better. They had made these paths themselves. And they were madly angry, so that do what they could, the dwarves heard the cries and howls getting closer and closer. Soon they could hear even the flap of the goblin feet, many, many feet, which seemed only just round the last corner. The blink of red torches could be seen behind them in the tunnel, and they were following, and they were getting deadly tired. "Why, oh why did I ever leave my hobbit hole?" said Poor Mr. Baggins, bumping up and down on Bomber's back. "Why, oh why did I ever bring a wretched little hobbit on a treasure hunt?" said poor Bomber, who was fat, and staggered along with the sweat dripping down his nose in his heat and his terror. At this point Gandalf fell behind, and Thorn with him. They turned a sharp corner. "About turn! Draw your sword, Thorn!" There was nothing else to be done, and the goblins did not like it. They came scurrying round the corner in full cry, and found Goblin Cleaver and Foe Hammer shining cold and bright right in their astonished eyes. The ones in front dropped the torches and gave one yell before they were killed. The ones behind yelled still more and leaped back, knocking over those that were running after them. "Biter and Beater!" they shrieked, and as soon as they were all in confusion, and most of them were hustling back the way that they had came. It was quite a long while before any of them dared to turn that corner. By that time the dwarves had gone on again, a long, long way on into the dark tunnels of the goblins' realm. And when the goblins discovered that, they put out their torches, and they slipped on soft shoes, and they chose out their very quickest runners with the sharpest ears and sharpest eyes. And these ran forward as swift as weasels in the dark, and with hardly any more noise than bats. That is why neither Bilbo, nor the dwarves, nor even Gandalf heard them coming. And nor did they see them. But they were seen by the goblins that ran silently up behind them, for Gandalf was letting his wand give out a faint light to help the dwarves as they went along. Quiet, suddenly Dory, now at the back again carrying Bilbo, was grabbed from behind in the dark. He shouted and fell, and the hobbit rolled off his shoulders into the blackness, bumped his head on a hard rock, and he remembered nothing more. When Bilbo opened his eyes, he wondered if he had, for it was just as dark as it was with his eyes shut. No one was anywhere near him. Just imagine his fright. He could hear nothing, see nothing, and he could feel nothing except the stone of the floor. Very slowly he got up and groped about on all fours till he touched the wall of the tunnel, but neither up nor down could he find anything. Nothing at all. No sign of goblins, no sign of dwarves. His head was swimming, and he was far from certain even of the direction they had been going in when he had his fall. He had guessed as well as he could and crawled along for a good way till suddenly his hand met what felt like a tiny ring of cold metal lying on the floor of the tunnel. It was a turning point in his career, but he did not know it. He put the ring in his pocket almost without thinking. Certainly, it did not seem of any particular use at the moment. He did not go much further, but sat down on the cold floor and gave himself up to complete miserableness for a long while. He thought of himself frying bacon and eggs in his own kitchen at home, for he could feel inside that he was high time for some meal or another. But that only made him more miserable. He could not think what to do, nor could he think what had happened, or why he had been left behind, or why, if he had been left behind, the goblins had not caught him, or even why his head was so sore. The truth was he had been lying quiet, out of sight and out of mind, in a very dark corner for a very long while. After some time he felt for his pipe. It was not broken, and that was something. Then he felt for his pouch, and there was some tobacco in it, and that was something more. And then he felt for matches, and he could not find any at all, and that shattered his hopes completely. Just as well for him as he agreed when he came to his senses. Goodness knows what the striking of matches and the smell of tobacco would have brought on him out of dark holes in that horrible place. Still, at the moment he felt very crushed, but in slapping all his pockets and feeling all round himself for matches, his hand came on the hilt of his little sword, the little dagger that he got from the trolls, and that he had quite forgotten, nor fortunately had the goblins noticed it, as he wore it inside of his breeches. And now he drew it out. It shone pale and dim before his eyes. So it is an elvish blade, too, he thought, and goblins are not very near, and yet not far away enough. But somehow he was comforted. It was rather splendid to be wearing a blade made in Gondolin for the goblin wars of which so many songs had been sung, and also he had noticed that such weapons made a great impression on goblins that came upon them suddenly. Go back? He thought. No good at all. Go sideways? Impossible. Go forward. Only thing to do. On we go. So up he got and trotted along with his little sword held in front of him, and one hand feeling the wall, and his heart all of a patter and all of a pitter. Now certainly Bilbo was in what is called a tight place, but you must remember it was not quite so tight for him as it would have been for me or for you. Hobbits are not quite like ordinary people, and after all, if their holes are nice cheery places and properly aired, they are quite different from the tunnels of the goblins, but still, they are more used to tunneling than we are, and they do not easily lose their sense of direction underground, not when their heads have recovered from being bumped. Also, they can move very quietly, and they can hide easily, and recover wonderfully from falls and bruises, and they have a fund of wisdom and wise sayings that men have mostly never heard or have forgotten long ago. I should not have liked to have been in Mr. Baggin's place all the same. The tunnel seemed to have no end. All he knew was that it was still going down pretty steadily and keeping in the same direction in spite of a twist and a turn or two. There were passages leading off to the side every now and then, as he knew by the glimmer of his sword, or he could feel with his hand on the wall. Of these openings he took no notice, except to hurry past for fear of goblins or half-imagined dark things coming out of them. On he went, and down, and still he heard no sound of anything except the occasional whir of a bat by his ears, which startled him at first, till it became too frequent to bother about. I do not know how long he kept on like this, hating to go on, not daring to stop, but on, until he was tired her, then tired. It seemed like all the way to tomorrow and over it to the days beyond. And suddenly, without warning, he trotted splash into the water.
Ugh.
It was icy cold. That pulled him up sharp and short. He did not know whether it was just a pool in the path or the edge of an underground stream that crossed the passage or the brink of a deep, dark, subterranean lake. The sword was hardly shining at all. He stopped, and he could hear, when he listened hard, drops, drip, drip, dripping from an unseen roof into the water below. But there seemed no other sort of sound. So it is a pool or a lake, and not an underground river, he thought. Still, he did not dare to wade out into the darkness. He could not swim, and he thought, too, of nasty, slimy things with big, bulging eyes wriggling in the water. There are strange things living in the pools and lakes in the hearts of mountains, fish whose fathers swam in, goodness knows how many years ago, and they never swam out again, while their eyes grew bigger and bigger and bigger from trying to see in the blackness. Also, there are other things more slimy than fish. Even in the tunnels and caves the goblins had made for themselves, there are other things living unbeknown to them that have sneaked in from outside to lie up in the dark. Some of these caves, too, go back in their beginnings to ages before the goblins, who only widened them and joined them up with passages, and the original owners are still there in odd corners, slinking and nosing about. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. Join me tomorrow for one of the most famous and probably iconic passages from anything Tolkien's ever read. See you then.